Hello everybody, welcome to the third class for the lecture course on AI and data ethics, which is the third part of the introductory lecture for the course, which I've very ambitiously entitled Intelligence, Civilization and Ethics, carrying on some of the themes that we started in the second part, in the last lecture. So, this is a quotation that we ended the last lecture on, which I'll just read out again. The potential benefits are huge. The potential benefits meaning the potential benefits of AI. Everything that civilization has to offer is a product of human intelligence. We cannot predict what we might achieve when this intelligence is magnified by the tools that AI may provide, but the eradication of war, disease and poverty would be high on anyone's list. Success in creating AI would be the biggest event in human history. Now I'll just point out a couple of features of the claims being made in this quotation. The claim that everything that civilization has to offer is a product of human intelligence. It makes it sound as if human intelligence is behind everything beneficial from civilization. But of course, if something is a product of something, we have to ask what else is in the mix. It says we cannot predict what we might achieve when this intelligence is magnified. So there's an assumption there. There's an assumption that if you have a good thing, then if you have more of it, then it's even better. It might seem obvious. It might seem obviously true, but actually it's not obviously true. Now, note, in the next clause, the eradication of war, disease and poverty would be high on anyone's list. Those are all complex questions, but let's take poverty, for example. There's currently enough wealth in the world for there to be no poor people. We have already enough wealth in the world for there to be no poor people. But is it intelligence which is stopping this from happening? Is it the lack of intelligence which is making war continue? We need to think about this really carefully. And actually, while we're on poverty, while we're on the question of poverty, let's think back over the last year. I'm recording this lecture in March 2021. Over the last year, since the pandemic started and since the lockdown started, there has been an absolutely unprecedented transfer of wealth from the poorest people in the world to the very, very richest people in the world, the really, really very, very richest people in the world. And a large part of that has been because of the change in the economy over the pandemic. And all of that has been enabled by the internet, by online world, by online shopping, and by the ways in which the internet has actually enabled the pandemic. So that so far from AI helping to eradicate poverty, what it's done in the last year is helped to do a massive Robin Hood in reverse in transferring wealth from the very poorest to the very richest. So that's something to think about, isn't it? Now, I'd obviously be very foolish to try to claim that I'm giving some full account of civilization in this very, very short lecture. But what I wanted to do is just to drop a few nuggets to think about to contrast with the quote we've just looked at. This image here is from Kenneth Clarke's famous documentary series Civilisation, which came on the BBC in the 1960s. And this is the very, very opening image, which is of Michelangelo's David. And I thought that David would be a great figure, actually, to contrast with the picture of intelligence and civilization that we've just seen. We're also going to meet King David later on. There are many reasons why he's a very, very contrasting figure, but he's obviously a critically important, one of the key important figures in the Bible, critical to the unfolding story of the history of the Old Testament, critical also in the understanding of the New Testament. And you don't have to be religious at all to realise the critical importance of figures like King David in our accounts of civilization and how we got to where we are now. Now, one of the reasons why King David is interesting to look at is, well, there's some fun facts about King David. He's one of a few people in the Bible who's described as being good looking. It appears that he probably had red hair. We know he was quite small and scrawny, and he famously, of course, beat Goliath. But he's a very, very, very complex figure. He was absolutely full of moral failings, and he played a very, very complex and surprising role in history. He was never supposed to be king. He was a shepherd. He was a shepherd who then became king. So when we're thinking about the warp and weft and the complex human stories that go to make up civilization, it seems to me to be very far from the case that we can tell this story simply in terms of intelligence. When we're thinking about the moral qualities of King David, his weaknesses, because of course his weaknesses also went to form the story of his role in history and his role in civilization. When we think of these, intelligence is not the first thing which comes to mind. Of course, it's part of it, but not the first thing that comes to mind. One of the things that strikes me when I think about quote about intelligence driving civilization is that actually quite a lot of what civilization has to offer is caused by sheer luck, sheer serendipity. Or maybe it's not sheer serendipity at all, but it's certainly nothing completely under our control. So, for example, most major cities are, well, obviously most major cities have got to be by sources of water. An awful lot of cities are on the sea or by rivers where there's fresh drinking water. And because we're close to water, that often means that we've got really good views. We've got water's really renowned for how it can help to calm the soul, how it can refresh us. Now, that's not a direct product of intelligence. We have to be by water because we need to drink. And major cities often grow up around water because it's a very good means of transporting people and goods. So the relationship between that and intelligence is actually far more complex than might be seen by a simple quote of thinking the more intelligence we have, the better, and that everything that we value in civilization is down to intelligence. Now, so that would be down to what you might call serendipity. And thinking of serendipity, just as I was preparing this lecture, this quote circulates around the internet quite a lot because it's quite a nice, touchy-feely quote. A quotation attributed to Margaret Mead, the famous anthropologist, when she was asked by a student about the first sign of civilization in a culture, who was expected to say it would be something which actually could seem to be a product of civilization, maybe something that we've made in some way, fushhooks or clay stones or clay pots or grinding stones. No, Margaret Mead said the first sign of civilization in an ancient culture was a thigh bone that's been broken and then healed. To explain that when in the animal kingdom, if you break your leg, you die. You can't run from danger, get to the river for a drink, or just hunt for food. You're meat for prowling beasts. But if a human has got a broken leg and it's healed, that would have taken weeks, if not months, to heal. So it's shown that someone stayed with the person, bound up the wound, carried them to safety, and looked after them. Now, I have seen people criticise this quotation and say, oh, that's not true, that animals do heal their legs and so on and so forth. But that's not quite so important as what it is that Mead is trying to pick out as being of critical importance to whether or not we say that there's civilization, which is, of course, it actually does involve quite a lot of intelligence to try to heal a leg like that, but it's far more than intelligence, it's the will to do so. Okay, so here's Neil Lawrence.
Artificial intelligence is not the same as humans. The A in AI does not stand for anthropomorphic. It stands for artificial. Artificial in the way that a plastic plant is artificial. There are real dangers with AI, as there are with any new technology. But if we are to face those dangers head on as a society, we need to understand what we are dealing with. We are defined by our need to communicate. Our lives are defined by the things we create, whether it's music, dance, art, literature, poetry, even sport. The computer has no need of these. Your cat understands you better than your computer understands you. Your cat understands me better than your computer understands me, and it hasn't even met me.
Okay, so Neil Lawrence, who you've just heard, is Professor of Machine Learning at Cambridge University. And that TED Talk that I just showed that little clip from is easily found on YouTube, and it's actually really quite worthwhile watching in full. So I made some brief comments about how civilization might involve a bit more of an intelligence. And in Neil's talk, in the little clip we just had there, he was offering some comments about how humans differ in really important and critical ways to computers, to machines, and how the way in which we relate to the world and relate to each other is going to be very, very different in lots of critical ways. So those kinds of things are things that we need to reflect on. We need to consider in detail human intelligence versus machine intelligence, and exactly what we might mean by intelligence in humans. I mean, this actually relates to some of the foundational questions behind AI, because one of the goals of some people in AI is try to use AI to try to understand human intelligence more, to use computers as a model for the human brain. But of course, humans are much more than brains. We need to understand human agency and decision making versus machine agency and decision making. And these are going to be really complex questions. So questions to consider, and these are questions which I come back to over and over and over again. We need to think about what happens when we replace or supplement or try to enhance human thought, human agency, and human decision making with that of intelligent machines. And in asking these questions, we need to also ask the question, how are humans affected by our use of AI? There are many, many ways in which this could happen. It can affect how we relate to other people. It can affect how we relate to the world. It can affect how we think about ourselves. It can affect us in actually really quite concrete ways, in ways in which skills that we have might be reduced by the use of AI, by our reliance on certain aspects of AI. So we need to think about this really critically, what impact this technology is having on our physical, emotional, and social development. Okay, so it's time for a little joke here. This is a little joke I had fun making. But we do need to think about differences, similarities between human nature and the nature of machines. One of the questions, of course, is there just a huge gulf between them, or can we see humans as being continuous machines? We might think that actually the human brain is simply like some really vast, very, very complicated computer, and maybe there's a sort of, maybe there's a continuum between them. On the other hand, other people will think there's going to be really, really large differences. But the little clip we just heard from Neil Lawrence suggests very strongly that there are a view that there are really major differences between them. And this little joke that I made illustrates a pretty common fear about robots, that maybe they'll be so different from us that their motivations are going to be completely different, that we're going to be sort of nicely making ourselves a little robot who then just wants to kill us. So we need to think about the differences and similarities between human agency and machine agency. We talk about agents in computing, but are they really agents in the same sort of way as humans are? There are many, many different dimensions in which there could be really great differences. So, and those differences and questions are going to raise questions about ethics. So, for example, when we're talking about human agency, one of the main reasons why we're interested in talking about human agency is in terms of attributing responsibility. We attribute responsibility to individual agents. How could we attribute responsibility to a machine? One of the ways in which it might be difficult is because when we're attributing responsibility, that often goes with blame or reward or punishment or praise. But it's very hard to see how you could punish or praise a computer or a robot. When we're talking about human agency, we can identify individual humans, and we can identify them over the course of a lifespan, where individuals are very, very different to each other and separated from each other by the fact of our physical bodies. Now, actually, this is obviously, as you can see, is not a robot at all. I've just used this. This is a little tin man made out of scraps of engines we found on a campsite in Picardy once, which I rather liked. But it does help to illustrate one of the problems with machine agency, that machines, computers or robots or any form of AI, is not going to be an individual in the same sort of way as a human is going to be an individual. You can take them apart and reassemble them. You can't do that with human beings. Human beings are uniquely one singular individuals, and that's actually critical to our understanding of human agency. Other ways in which we might see difference, human agency is really complex. I mean, actually, the points that I was making about David in the previous slide illustrate that as well, how complex human beings are. And one of the ways in which they seem to be complex is how our agency is often seen to be marred by emotions or marred by what you might call a higher self, or our lower self might be trying to interfere. We might be dragged in ways that we are against our better judgment, for example. We don't really think of machines as having that kind of problem. So human agency might seem to be less reliable than machines, often seem to be less reliable because we're more biased, because we're biased by our emotions, by our partialities. So if machines of course can be biased, well, we're going to be looking at that in a previous lecture, there could be bias in the machines, but we don't think that computers are going to be biased because, oh, that's their favourite, or they have favouritism, or because they got a blind spot because they're dealing with their own families. They don't even have families. So humans are going to be really different. So the way in which we think about agency and machine agency, and humans agency and machine agency, and how we think about it morally is going to be really, really complex. So for example, this might make a difference to how we attribute responsibility. We might have perhaps higher standards in machine agency than with human agency, which might be a good thing. So for example, it's often suggested that if we ever develop autonomous vehicles to the extent that we can really rely on them, we'll have higher expectations in terms of safety. Because if a human has a crash, sometimes, of course, we're going to attribute blame, but very often we will feel actually really immensely sorry for the person who happened to be at the wheel when some catastrophe happened, and we'll actually put ourselves in their position and maybe give them a bit of leniency. But if it's a computer, we're going to be less liable to do that. We're going to be less likely to do that. So one of the questions about human nature that we're going to have to ask about, we're going to have to think about, is the place of humans in nature, the place of humans in the rest of the natural world. Are human beings the only source of value in an inert, meaningless universe, or is there some other source of value outside of humanity? This is a really broad question to ask, but it's critical in terms of whether or not we're seeing artificial intelligence perhaps simply as a tool that humans can use as they wish, or whether or not we could understand artificial intelligence in terms of perhaps some progress towards a future of which humans are simply a part. These are going to be really big questions which underlie a lot of the attitudes towards how we view AI, how we view our role in AI, and how we view our future together with AI. Some views of a place of humans in nature see humans as, say, the current pinnacle for some evolution. That evolution has produced humans who are now the most evolved animals on the planet. Obviously, I know full well, I'm not making that claim myself. I know many people will disagree with that. So there's various ways in which you can stake that forward. You might think, therefore, that we must make certain that AI doesn't undermine humanity as it is, because it represents a large value. Or we might think that actually humans are just an interim stage in evolution, and that AI is going to be one stage better. There are also views that see humans as having some particular role in developing and taking care of a world, a particular caretaker role, and that could go any way in terms of how we think about AI. We might think that technology is actually one of the ways in which we can take care of a world, or that technology, including AI, is one of the ways in which we're actually spreading disaster throughout the world. But anyway, these large questions about the place of humans in nature underlies all the ethical questions that we're looking at in AI, underlines all the ethical questions we have anyway, actually, which is one of the reasons why I'm constantly saying that ethics is never just about ethics. It's always about a larger picture of our place in the natural world and in the universe. One of the questions we need to look at is how malleable do we think human beings are? How malleable can they be and remain human beings? We obviously are very malleable as a species, actually, and we're also changed very much by our technology. So one of the questions about AI is, how much can we manipulate human beings? How much are we being manipulated by AI? How much we are being moulded by the use of computing? How much we're being moulded by other people and how they use our computing? That's one of the big questions that we're going to be looking at. And we're going to need to ask the question, what is a person? We could ask the question whether or not a robot or an AI could ever be a person. The question of what it is to be a person is often distinguished from what it is to be a human being. So you could be a human being but not a person, according to some philosophers, or you could perhaps be a person but not a human being. So many, for example, would argue that some of the great apes would count as persons, or you might think that, say, other rational beings or creatures living on other planets might also count as persons. So to be a person is to be a creature that is the object of moral concern, that has moral value, but also is capable of acting and reasoning and thinking morally. Now, over the last several decades, A lot of philosophers have actually tried to produce definitions of what it is to be a person, which often cluster around capacities such as talking about the capacities we have, for example, in terms of the capacity to think of ourselves as an individual with desires, and the capacities to think rationally and to have reason. So it's quite interesting that many of these philosophical accounts of what it is to be a person actually stress cognitive or intellectual aspects, cognitive capacities, which then you might think, since we're not talking anything in particular about any particular sort of embodiment, could perhaps be held by computers or by robots. But this is a very complex story, because stressing the cognitive capacities of human beings might be seen to downplay some of the other capacities that make us more human, that make us valuable. It's actually, I can keep on realising that I keep on slipping between person and human in talking about this, because we do tend mostly to think about persons as being human beings. But when we're talking about also treating somebody as a person, we also naturally then can easily slip into talking about treating them with humanity. Or if we talk about treating somebody not as a person, we can talk about dehumanizing them. So it's really easy to see how we can slip from one to the other. But it's often thought that perhaps our ways in which we think about persons, the way in which some philosophers have thought about persons, is very much geared towards the mind, towards the cognitive, and very much away from the embodied aspects of what it is to be a person. And those embodied aspects of what it is to be a human being often relate, well, very closely to biological facts about us, the fact that we all have relatives, the fact that every single one of us was born of a woman, that we went through a period of helpless development as a child, and that if we're lucky, we'll grow old, and of course we're all going to die, and that we're all embodied individuals. That it's our body, as I mentioned earlier in talking about agency, our bodies form boundaries of ourselves which are inviolable, which you just can't get out of. But the question of a relationship between mind and body is, as again, I keep on touching on questions that you could have entire lecture courses on. But again, it's part of my purpose to try to show to you how these questions about ethics in AI are really closely related to complex and profound questions, ongoing questions in the philosophy of mind as well as in moral philosophy. And again, I can't possibly go here into all the different questions about the relationship between the mind and body and the implications that might have for computing and how we think about AI and robots. But here's just a well-known quote from Descartes' Meditations on the First Philosophy, on a question that he raised about the nature of mind and body. So Descartes very famously held a dualist view, where he thought that there was mental substance which was quite distinct from physical substance. So his view of the relationship between mind and body was that mind was somehow joined to the body, in what the 20th century philosopher Gilbert Ryle famously and sarcastically dubbed the ghost in the machine. But Descartes grappled with what exactly is this mysterious connection between the mind and the body. So it's quite a good illustration to just demonstrate the difficulty of this area of philosophy and the difficulties that then is produced in how we think about AI, how we might think about robots, whether or not, for example, a robot could ever develop consciousness. So Descartes said, nature also teaches me by the sensations of pain, hunger, thirst, and so on, that I am not merely present in my body as a sailor is present in a ship, but that I am very closely joined and, as it were, intermingled with it, so that I and my body form a unit. It's actually almost comical, the difficulties that Descartes has got himself into by producing this very stark dualist conception of the difference between the mind and body, because then he's stumbling over saying, well, actually, it's not like I'm just here steering something. I'm somehow intermingled with my body, which I think actually really marvellously sums up the difficulties in trying to actually explain how mind and body do intermingle in this way. But of course, it's critical for how we think of ourselves as humans and how we might think about robots or the possibility of conscious AI. And I promised you that we would look at King David later on. So this is an extract from Psalm 8, which is called a Psalm of David. The reason why I'm putting it in is because I also wanted to illustrate one of the very common views in various accounts of human nature. There are common strands in how we think about human nature and how we understand the place of humans in the universe. It's really, really common that there's some account whereby there's something which is labelled higher, whether it's God or reason or angels, and something which is labelled lower, which is, say, the animals, or maybe often attributed an animal part of humans, and humans are somehow in the middle. And again, somehow being caught in the middle We're in some kind of like in-between state, which often produces an account of conflict. So these sorts of accounts are really, really common. They're going to sort of permeate how we think about human nature, and therefore permeate how we think about AI and how we think about robotics. But let's just look at what is said in Psalm 8. What is man that thou art mindful of him, and the son of man that thou visitest him? For thou hast made him a little lower than the angels, and hast crowned him with glory and honour. Thou hast made him to have dominion over the works of thy hands. Thou hast put all things under his feet. So on this particular account, of course, we're not just simply seeing humans as somehow being in an in-between level between God or angels and the lower animals, but having a particular role, having dominion over the works of a creator, and having all things under his feet. Dominion, of course, doesn't mean complete control. It doesn't mean that you can do randomly what you want to them, but it's to have a particular role in a creation which is also seen to be valuable. But let's have a look a little bit more at the context. I'm not a theologian. I'm not going to give you a full account of Psalm 8. There's an awful lot of complex commentary that you could make about it. But when I read this, there's something which stands out to me, which I feel in contrast actually to a lot of the work of many people working in AI, some of the people who have a very futuristic account of AI, or some of the attitudes towards technology, but we can use it to advance ourselves, and it's up to us to sort of get hold of technology and do whatever we want with it. Remember that King David was a shepherd, and I may be completely wrong, but when I read this, I imagine him as being a shepherd lying out under the stars, as millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions, billions of humans have done throughout history, and gazing up at the stars in a sense of wonder. He starts off, O Lord, our Lord, how excellent is thy name in all the earth, who has set thy glory upon the heavens. There's a sense of wonder in the rest of the world. And second verse, there's a lot of interesting commentary of what's actually meant by this, but out of the mouth of babes and sucklings hast thou ordained strength because of thine enemies, that thou mightest still the enemy and the avenger. So there's an idea that God is using the weak as part of his plan, which is actually really interesting when we think about it in terms of notions of, Robocop, for instance. Let's contrast this with Robocop, those sorts of images that you often get in AI and sci-fi, and fears actually about AI and robotics. But in verse 3, when I consider the heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars which thou hast ordained, what is man that thou art mindful of him, and the son of man that thou visitest him? I just imagine him gazing up at the stars, of the thought that I think many, if perhaps not most human beings, have all some point of their lives had. You look up at the stars and you it doesn't stop you thinking that we're important. It doesn't stop you thinking that humans are really amazing and really, really great, strange creatures, which again doesn't stop you thinking that animals are also amazing and really great, strange creatures as well, or that plants and trees and the rest of it is. But as there's a sense of wonder and a sense of awe and a sense of wonder about what exactly is our place in all of this. And I think it's an attitude that I think it's really useful to have in terms of how we're thinking about moral questions and about how we're thinking about ethical issues in relation to AI or in relation to anything, actually. Because one of the things I really think we need to be careful of is being absolutely certain that we're right about something and losing that sense of wonder and excitement and awe and value in the world around us and in our position in it. And that's something that I sometimes think is being lost inside the world of technology. So that's my sermon over for the class. So don't worry, I'll try not to dip too much into talking in such grandiose terms, but it's something that I wanted to point out. And I'm using Psalm 8. I love it, actually. I really love Psalm 8, but I'm using it not to sort of be Bible thumping or to stick a particular view at you, but just to see, are these questions arise? How do we think about this in different contexts? And to use Psalm 8 actually as an example of a typical model of how we think about the place of humans in nature. And it's not the only one, of course, and there are contrasting versions of it. And we might want to reject it and come up with something completely different, but that's for you to think about. Accounts of human nature often have accounts of where we come from, accounts of a past state, and often accounts of a future state or how we might progress. So there are some accounts, some creation accounts, where humans may have been seen to have fallen in some way, or there might be some explanation for how we've got the problems that we have. Maybe if you might have an account of, say, the fall of man, where there's something that's happened which explains our failings, or you might have an account where there was never any fall, but maybe through evolution, we're just making gradual progress towards something. Likewise, with this account of a future state, some goal towards which we're aiming, as example illustrated in this, I love these pictures, Edward Hicks' series, the Peaceable Kingdom series from around the 1830s, where he illustrated some passages from Isaiah which look forward to a future peaceable state. The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, and the calf and the lion and the fattened calf together, and a little child shall lead them. Incidentally, this vision of a peaceable state of animals and humans all living in a state of calm peace together sheds new light on any idea that we saw in Psalm 8, that mankind has dominion over the animals. And as you'll see in many people talking about AI, they also have what you might see visions of a future state, visions of progress towards which we should be heading, which you might actually see in some of the visionaries in AI as actually presenting religious or quasi-religious teleological views of the universe as tending towards some end, and often actually in some views actually having the role in common that humans have got seen to have some particular view, some particular role to play in bringing about a future state, of bringing about this teleological goal. Sometimes people would say that humans have got a particular role to play in actually creating AI and helping the universe to develop. And we also need to ask a really basic question. What is the object of morality? Why do we even have such a thing? We can easily start in asking questions about ethics about any particular area, including AI, by thinking, oh, these are the questions, these are the moral theories that we have, and we can apply them and try to get an answer. But more fundamentally, we need to ask, why are we even thinking about morality in the first place? And one of the reasons why we often think about morality is because we're asking questions about human failings, about the sorts of weaknesses that we have, about how to try to make our way through this imperfect world. And that will be seen to be imperfect in ways with various limitations that we have and various limitations that the world has. So that's all going to shape how we think about morality, how we think about ethics. But if we're using AI, if we have ways in which, go back to the quote at the beginning, if we can use AI to solve all those fundamental problems of civilization, problems about war, disease and poverty, and of course there are many, many more, then is this going to really radically change the landscape within which we think about ethics? If AI is shaping us, if AI is shaping our agency, if it's going to help us maybe overcome some of our weaknesses, are we even going to think about these ethical questions in a completely different way? So that's one of, again, background questions we need to think about, that AI is actually helping us to raise. If it's shaping us, if it's shaping radically how we think about ourselves, how we relate to other people, and how we relate to the world around us, then maybe it's also altering and shaping how we even think about ethics. So I'm very much aware that all I'm doing in these introductory classes is actually showing exactly how complex and the questions about AI and ethics are. But as I've said before, I have really come to the conclusion that actually asking these questions has been the most interesting philosophical work that I've done so far, and I hope that you're going to find it really interesting as well. So just to reflect on a few of these points, we need to compare and contrast AI with human agency very carefully. We need to keep an open mind about how we frame the ethical questions and how we address them. We need to keep an open mind about how we're actually doing ethics in relation to AI. We can't take a formula about how to think about ethics and just apply it. There are a wide range of questions from within other areas of philosophy, such as philosophy of mind, which also require our attention. And there are many areas as well outside of philosophy. So see, it's really easy, isn't it? I hope you're going to enjoy listening to the rest of the lecture course. Thanks very much.